getting any warble in your... What? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay.
Would you do that again?
Seven, 11, 7, 11, 7.
Adam?
Chuck Percy and ladies and gentlemen. Well, actually, when I arrived here, I met a great horde of newspapermen that came up to me and said, thought they were going to ask me, what are you going to say tonight? And all they kept saying is, did you hear what Chuck Percy said? So I couldn't get it out of my mind, but I'm glad to see Chuck Daly, too. I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry that I was unable to make it last night. We have a lot of snow in the east, 8 inches. I knew you'd feel badly for us. But I'm very happy to finally be here, and I'm happy that the merchandise mart is open. It means a great deal to all of us Kennedys. Next to my father working, that's the best thing. I am delighted to be out here and speak on China, and talk to you about everything I know about China. I feel a little bit like the man who survived the Johnstown flood. He, who did?
Roger
Oh, God. You think it's good? Yeah. Is it good enough to go twice?
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I feel the same way. Well, we're going to have to go from the Johnstown flood to Disraeli, who said, "Finality is not the language of politics, and seldom have we been more forcefully reminded of this fact than by the recent course of Chinese history and our relations with her." Let me say before I begin that I have a rather long address, and I've cut some of it. Some of you will be happy to hear. And so, but I want to make sure that everybody understands, and those in the press who might report it, that I stand by all of the things within the text, but I just wanted to spare the audience from going through all of it, so I've dropped a little bit of it. Seldom have we been more forcefully reminded of this fact than by the recent course of Chinese history and our relations with her. And seldom have we been more in need of that reminder as we begin after 15 years for the search of a new China policy. America is beginning to rediscover China, for all the world as if it were a new strange planet found by our astronauts. For over 15 years, China has not been a significant factor in American political or intellectual life. Once we fought our armies on the Korean battlefield, twice in the 1950s. By the testimony of the then Secretary of State, we came to the brink of nuclear war. And for a brief moment, 2 offshore islands became an issue in a presidential campaign. But for the most part, China has been ignored. Partly this is because the main thread of the Cold War was our relationship with the Soviet Union. Not only a far more powerful adversary, armed with advanced nuclear weapons, but also the acknowledged leader of the world communist movement, and hence China's senior partner. Our energies were primarily focused on the security and the reconstruction of Europe. A second reason was the isolation of communist China. Refused admission to the United Nations, unrecognized by us and by many other countries. A China, moreover, which deliberately increased its isolation by eliminating foreign influence and excluding foreigners from her territory. Now all of this has begun to change, easing relations with the Soviet Union, the Sino-Soviet split, China's own accession to nuclear power, and the war in Vietnam have forced our attention on the Far East and to our relations with a nation unlike any other, in its size, in its outlook, in its problems, and in the hostility of its relations with the United States. It is safe to say that there is no aspect of American foreign policy so important and yet so uncertain, no country so seemingly menacing about which we know so little as is China. I do not intend to review or assess the full range of China policy. We know too little, and events are too quickly changing what little we do know. Nevertheless, some salient points can and should be made, and it is those I would like to discuss with you tonight. The first and overriding consideration is that this is a time of unique opportunity. The great proletarian cultural revolution, whatever else it has done, ensures that China will wish to focus its attention on internal affairs for at least the immediate future. As is apparent from her diplomacy or lack of it all over the world, China seems to have little present wish for contact or change in her foreign policy. For us, therefore, this is a chance above all to think, to review the past, to analyze the present, to plan for the future course of relations between our two nations. This is a chance which rarely comes to scholars or statesmen or nations in time of constant challenge or swirling change, and we could do no better than to begin that assessment now. Such an assessment would begin with history, the history of this proudest and oldest of civilizations, shaken and brought low by its contacts with the West. Then for a century racked by constant revolution and civil war, flood and famine, humiliation and foreign invasion. And the last 20 years part of a chapter whose ending is far from certain. The assessment would explore the paradox of China today, traditional nationalism and modern revolutionism, nuclear strength and conventional weakness, economic achievements and managerial failures. The assessment would separate bold rhetoric from cautious action and grandiose intent from modest capabilities. It would help to preserve us from either overreaction or underestimation of the dangers and challenges which China poses for all of us. For these twin products of ignorance and misjudgment have both cost us dear in the past. Commerce gives us greater influence in Asia than any other nation, and across the vast sweep of that continent in which we are so deeply involved, China looms more importantly and more dangerously than any other. Indeed, it was the fact of Chinese communist power which led us, through treaty and the movement of forces, to assume over the last decade the position that we hold today. Yet for many years we have disposed our forces, we have made commitments and conducted our enterprises virtually without conscious policy and direction, unaware of what we seek and the price we are prepared to pay. We have striven to isolate China from the world and treated it with unremitting hostility. That, however, is not a policy. It is an attitude founded upon fear and passion and wishful hopes. In Korea, the Formosa Straits, in India, we responded to immediate situations of danger, and without any question, many of those actions were necessary. But they were designed to protect the present rather than to prepare for the future. I want to make it clear that those responses and those actions, this lack of knowledge and consistent policy, are not the failures of one administration or one political party. Indeed, there has been more growth in our awareness and knowledge of the problem in the past year than in the past decade. But there are still needs, and the first need is a policy. And the time to at least begin to develop one is right now. Political passions have dimmed, understanding and concern are rising, as you are demonstrating in such an important way. The Cold War in the West is calmed, allowing us to divert some energy and some thought to this part of the world. Most importantly, as danger grows and the war in Vietnam unveils the tragic possibility of recurring and draining conflict, necessity, the midwife of foreign policy, crowds in upon us. Such a policy will emerge not out of a sudden revelation, but slowly out of discussion and danger, from shifting events and from painful battles. It will not, however, come of itself. We must make active efforts to think and to plan and to learn and decide and to act. This process is now beginning, and your conference is part of it. I would not therefore pretend to detail a China and an Asian policy, but we can discuss what a policy is and begin to glimpse some general direction for the policy that must come. At the outset, let us say what a policy is not. First, a position which pleases us without a reasonable chance of acceptance or accomplishment is not a policy. Thus, the liberation of the mainland by nationalist China was at best empty rhetoric and at worst a dangerous illusion. Second, faith in the ultimate goodness of human nature or the ameliorating impact of progress is not a policy. We cannot await with confidence the day when material wealth and a better understanding of economic reality will bring China or a new generation of Chinese leaders, quote, to their senses. The history of our time gives ample proof that advanced, cultured, and self-confident nations are fully capable of dark disorder, violence, and aggression. It was not Stalin but Khrushchev who, in the 40th year of the Russian Revolution, crushed Hungary and 7 years later brought the whole world to the brink of nuclear war in his Cuban adventure. It was a Germany advanced far beyond the distant goals of China, which half destroyed a continent and slaughtered millions. Moreover, nuclear weapons today can give a country a capacity to destroy far greater than its real power or wealth. And that fact by itself will undoubtedly influence China's leaders, perhaps in a dangerous, although still in an unpredictable way. And that fact will change the course of events. Certainly we must recognize that the conflict in Vietnam would be quite different now if China had the capacity to destroy Chicago or even New York with nuclear missiles. China may or may not become less aggressive and dangerous as it progresses, as the Soviet Union may, as Germany may, or Japan may, or as we ourselves may. It is praiseworthy to hope and work for Chinese moderation, but to look upon moderation as the certain fruit of time and act accordingly is to tempt fatal danger. Third, the desire for reconciliation or the hope of friendship is not a policy. Hostility springs from the clash of interests and ambitions, and their resolution or compromise is at the heart of any accommodation. This mutual acceptance of legitimate claims and interests must precede any reconciliation. Thus, policy is the determination of terms on which reconciliation can and will be carried out. And this is far more than just a desire to be friends. Fourth, faith in the certainty of our historical judgment is not a policy. We cannot act as if we know China will certainly try to expand by force or that it will never try. We cannot assume that communist expansion in Asia would inevitably be swallowed up by the nationalism of Asian states. Nor should we assume that all revolutions will be captured by communists or that all who call themselves communists will come under the domination and control of Peking. Rather, we must prepare for all the contingencies which threaten the clear national interests of the United States. So a policy is none of these, just as it is not fear or hostility or wish. Policy is the establishment of goals and a course of action rationally calculated to achieve those goals. And we do not now have such a policy toward China. We have acted often, and those actions were supported by reasons of varying wisdom and persuasion. Yet rarely have our stated reasons and goals been pursued with the consistency and sustained application which would raise them to the dignity of policy. Thus they have often become justifications for particular acts rather than expressions of consistent national purpose. It has been suggested, for example, that we are pursuing strategic interests in Asia, denying the control of other lands and resources to Asian communism. Yet less than 2 years ago, we were quite prepared, all of us, I believe, to accept the spread of communism to Indonesia, a nation of 100 million people, incomparably rich in resources, standing over the critical Straits of Malacca and flanking the Philippines. Of course, we want to prevent the expansion, the acquisition of vast new resources by powers deeply hostile to the United States. That statement, however, is only the beginning of thought. How do we discriminate between Chinese expansion and an autonomous revolt? Where and under what circumstances can we bring our power to bear effectively? Where and under what circumstances should we limit ourselves to helping others without hazarding large-scale combat or major war? These are not easy questions to answer, but until we at least begin to discuss and to debate them, we will be unable to develop any kind of long-range planning, let alone a policy. And let me add that we are told that nations must learn to leave their neighbors alone. Yet we do not always leave our neighbors in this hemisphere alone. Nor can we righteously announce that we seek only freedom and human dignity and decency throughout the world, when we have supported, for what we felt good cause, repressive and corrupt governments in every continent of the world. I do not quarrel with the necessity of some of the actions which were inconsistent with these principles, but those actions do teach us that blanket moral statements cannot determine all strategic judgments, and that their enunciation is not a substitute for policy. It may well be that greater consistency with the moral principles upon which this nation rests might, in the long run, lead to a sounder policy and greater protection for the interests of the United States. I personally believe that this to be so. Yet if we solemnly pronounce principles which will not or cannot be consistently applied, we delude ourselves and invite serious charges of hypocrisy from others throughout the world. In Africa, I have tried to answer the question: if the United States is fighting for self-determination in Vietnam, then how can it not support the independent struggles that are going on in Angola and Mozambique? For those questioners, it is less our intention than our pretension which is objectionable. For to this question, there is no satisfactory answer. Thus does false principle destroy the credibility in our wisdom and purpose, which is the true foundation of influence as a world power. We are not alone in China. We are not alone with China in Asia. There is also India, the second most populous nation in the world, in itself a great civilization. Japan, soon to become the third leading industrial nation of the globe, Indonesia, with its resources and commanding strategic position. In the long run, the vision and the commitment of these great Asian nations will determine in large part the course of affairs on their continent, just as it is Great Britain and West Germany and France and Italy, which now set the primary thrust of development in Western Europe. Thus, our policy must be shaped, our actions undertaken, in full understanding of the interests and the actions of these nations, and with the consciousness that we do not act as a substitute, but rather as a supplement to their policy. And further, of great importance, we must understand that our policy toward China must be a major factor in determining our policy toward those countries which border on China, indeed all of Asia, in the economic, military, political, and the diplomatic fields. We are not working in a vacuum. Thus, if a strong and free India is considered vital to our national security, the level of our economic and military assistance should reflect that priority. If the lives of thousands of Americans are lost and billions of dollars committed on the theory that Vietnam is essential to us, how can we refuse to assist others on the border of China, whose demands may be less, but whose strategic importance and whose vulnerability to external and internal communist domination may be greater? So we see that this discussion is not just a policy toward China, but necessarily toward all those along her borders, including the Soviet Union. If we choose to remain an Asian power, surely we have learned that a failure to act can have the gravest consequences. We must be prepared to pay the cost in economic assistance, for example, even if that cost is, as it must be, many times greater than that which we are now paying, in order to avoid the price in blood and treasure that we pay today. Although we can have only minimal effect on China itself today, we can have a major effect on the future of Asia, and thus lessen the danger of Chinese expansion to the extent that we pursue these important programs of strengthening other Asian nations. Although it is not precisely analogous, it must be remembered that it was the Marshall Plan which served more to contain Soviet expansion than the troops on her border. This group could surely apply your experience and knowledge to Asia to develop and recommend this kind of a program and a policy. But even then, we must recognize that our China policy will be formed out of paradox and complexity. Thus, the Soviet Union, our principal adversary and competitor in the post-war world, is at least for the time being China's violent ideological opponent, with what often seems a very different vision of the Asian future. Thus also Japan, our former enemy and present ally, China's historical rival and imitator, invader and economic partner, today at once contracts with the Soviet Union to develop the resources of Siberia, conducts large investment campaigns in China, proposing, among other things, to develop China's petrochemicals industry, serves as a major U.S. base, and contributes the first $200 million to the Asian Development Bank. And thus also, in another part of the world, at the same time our officials were warning of a Chinese threat to NATO, travelers reported that Peking hotel space was impossible to get because of the number of trade missions there from NATO countries. China policy must be formed against the probability that when present convulsions subside, we will still face a hostile China. We will still have to refuse the temptation of assuming that any acts or gestures on our part will significantly improve relations. Yet hostile words and proclamations are not wars. They do not prevent us from having contact or from reaching agreements on matters of mutual interest. They do not prevent us from having contacts which could lead us to know more about China and they about us, and thus preventing the miscalculation of intention which could lead to a total worldwide Holocaust. We should not discourage contact of any kind by ourselves or any other nation, whether economic or diplomatic, even tourism, for a rational and informed China will be far easier to deal with than an irrational and ignorant one. Our policy must rest on the knowledge that we cannot predict the possibility of Chinese military expansion. Therefore, we must be prepared to help others defend themselves while refusing to base our actions and our policies on the assumption that armed clash is inevitable. For we must realize that every extension of Chinese influence does not automatically menace us. We must be able to discriminate between armed attack and internal revolution, between Chinese direction of revolutionary forces and Chinese exhortation. Where Chinese force is not directly involved or borders crossed, we must ask whether we should be willing to rely above all on the strength and vitality of the desire for national independence. After all, it is that powerful desire and not our military force which ousted the Chinese from Central Africa and Algeria and Indonesia, and which is steadily eroding the Soviet Empire. Policy demands a conscious and open recognition that we live in the same world and move in the same continent as China, with its dangers and possibilities, strengths and terrible frustrations. Only when we accept this reality can we work toward our central task, to bring about Chinese acceptance of the fact that it too must live with us and with other nations of the world. These are admittedly general considerations rather than guides to specific action. Yet it will make a great difference to our acts and our policies if we treat China as a potential danger. The future of our relations with China may lie beyond our vision, but it is not completely beyond our control. It is the shaping impulse of America that neither fate nor nature, nor the irresistible tides of history, but the work of our own hands, matched to reason and principle, which can determine destiny. There is pride in that, even arrogance, but there is also experience and truth. In any event, it is the only way that we can live. All of our intentions and labor may ultimately dissolve in violence and bloodshed, but there is another possibility. Perhaps someday an American diplomat may go to China, carrying with him the same instructions Daniel Webster gave to Caleb Cushing in 1843. To tell the people of China, he said, that your mission is entirely pacific, that you are a messenger of peace, sent from the greatest power in America to the greatest in Asia, to offer respect and goodwill, and to establish the means of friendly intercourse. It doesn't all depend on you or on America, but you have a great part to play, and you will earn the gratitude of the world if you play it well. I thank you.
The Senator's indicated he'd be glad to enter into a discussion with you if any of you happen to have a question or two. Senator, you want to take the podium?
Upon the racist character of American life and how that influences our view towards China. Would you care to comment on that?
I wasn't aware that was a very important or major factor, to tell you the truth. I can't see anybody, so that's a rather disadvantage.